Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. Venturing into uncharted territories feeds the hunger of adventure seekers for adrenaline. In this week's story, we feature 4 climbers who did exactly just that at Mount Haramosh, among the mountain ranges of Pakistan. All of a sudden, they heard a loud bang, and within seconds, the snow where 2 of the climbers stood moved and brought them rolling down the mountain. This is their horrifying story. Viewer discretion is advised. "31-year-old Tony Strether was a soldier from the Royal Military Academy and has been part of many climbing expeditions. Some of his expeditions were the American K2 expedition in 1953 and the first ascent to Kanchenjunga in 1955. He also held the record of being the first man to conquer 2 summits higher than 7,600 meters. With his extensive experience, Strether became the expedition leader of the 5-man team from the Oxford University Mountaineering Club that was set out to conquer Mount Haramosh. Along with him were Bernard Gillett, John Emery, Ray Culbert, and Scott Hamilton, all in their 20s. Being the president of the Mountaineering Club, it was Gillett's idea to go on an expedition to this unexplored route of the Haramash sub-mountain range. It was late July 1957, the 5-man expedition team arrived in the city of Gilgit in Pakistan. Here, they were greeted by the 6 Hunza porters, whom they hired to help them carry their supplies and equipment to the camps. Half of the porter team were seasoned porters already, having assisted a lot of expeditions by then, while the other half were fairly new to the porter industry. The team started off with their hike through the north to west routes, but eventually gave in to the fact that these were nearly impossible to explore. So, the team decided to hike to Cutwell Valley to check for the next possible route going up the summit of Mount Haramosh. Upon reaching the Cutwell Valley, as they were looking up at the majestic view of the mountains, they noticed that there was a long ridge that lined towards the northeast and further to the peak of the mountain. Now, Mount Haramosh has 2 peaks. The first peak was 24,270 feet above sea level, while the second one was 21,930 feet above sea level. This new route that they saw would take them first to Haramosh 2, before they could get to the much higher Haramosh 1. Getting to Haramosh 1 would mean they had to descend around 600 meters from Haramosh 2, before continuing to hike up the first peak. What they couldn't see from below was that this stretch would be a long and extremely difficult one. The trail between the 2 peaks was filled with crevasses and a glacier that seemed like it could come crumbling anytime. It was a rough start for the 5-man team and their porters. The weather has been going against them, snowing non-stop and leaving a thick pile of fresh snow on their trails. As they traversed the mountain with much struggle, they could hear the sound of a rushing avalanche of snow from mountains nearby. This kept them conscious and worried, but they pressed on, slowly but surely. It has been a month and a half since they started their expedition in Mount Haramosh. They were almost near the end of their Pakistan trip, but still very far from the summit. The team slowly advanced from Camp 1 to Camp 2, but the hike was nothing short of challenging. Weather conditions were still not improving, and forecasts don't see it improving in the next few days either. They reached Camp 3, despite the challenging conditions. However, it was also at Camp 3 that Hamilton decided to stay behind and wait for them to come back. Meanwhile, the porters went back to the lower camps after having brought all their supplies and gear to Camp 3. The other 4 men continued on to Camp 4, which was just less than 2,000 feet away from the Haramosh 2 peak. Emery and Culbert stopped over at Camp 4, but Gillett and Strether attempted to go further, before realizing their bodies needed a breather. Eventually, they decided to head back to Camp 4. Then came September 15th, the 4 men were together at Camp 4, and the skies started to clear up. This only meant one thing for them: they might have a chance to conquer the peak. Taking every chance, by 11 o'clock in the morning, the 4 men were now back on the trails. Strether arrived at the crest first, and the minute he saw the wide view from the top, he was awestruck. The other 3 climbers arrived at the crest not long after, and they too were completely in awe. The view was breathtaking, literally and figuratively. After a while, they descended a few feet below the peak where it was safer to stay and enjoy basking in the view. They sat down right below the almost vertical slope to the peak, as they felt a sense of fulfillment with how far they reached. It didn't all go exactly as planned. Had it not been for the bad weather, they could have probably reached Haramash too, but still, this wasn't an easy feat. Having explored the mountain was more than enough for them. However, like any other climb, reaching the summit was one thing, and descending was a whole different story. As they were about to head back to Camp 4, Gillett wanted to climb back up the peak for the last time. Together with his buddy Emery, they went back to the peak, while Strether and Colbert stayed behind. As Strether and Colbert enjoyed taking pictures of the view, suddenly, they heard a loud bang. The pile of snow where Gillett and Emery were standing gave in without warning, and sent both hikers rolling down the slope along with the avalanche. Strether and Colbert saw with their own eyes everything that happened. Fearing for the lives of their friends, they quickly looked over the steep slope to check on them. The fall was so bad that they thought they lost their friends, as they could no longer find traces of them in the thick piles of snow. But after a few heart-wrenching minutes, they sighed in great relief when they saw their friends slowly emerging from beneath the snow. The two, Emery and Gillett, landed 1,000 feet below, surrounded by thick walls of snow, with their ice axes nowhere to be found. Gillett had only one glove left, while both of Emery's gloves were missing. To make matters even worse, Emery's hip bone got dislocated due to the impact. Seeing their condition and their risk for hypothermia, Strether and Colbert decided to drop one of their backpacks filled with clothes, so their friends could add more layers to keep them warm. However, another unfortunate incident happened. The backpack landed on a different crevice. So after a failed attempt to get themselves out of the crevice, Gillett and Emery had no choice but to spend the night out in the open, embracing each other to keep them warm. The next day, wanting to help their friends so badly, Strether and Colbert agreed that the only way to help them get out of the crevice was to go down to where they were and take them out. In doing this, they're putting themselves at equal risk. It was a challenging descent, but they took each step with utmost care. After hours of difficulty, they reached Gillett and Emery, but on the way down, Colbert lost one of his crampons and Strether lost his ice axe. It was a tearful moment for the four of them, having been reunited, yet bittersweet because they still didn't know how to get themselves out. The first strategy they came up with was for the four of them to be tied together using a rope, and slowly climb up and make their way out of the crevice. They were supposedly covering distance already, but Colbert, whose other crampon was missing, kept slipping and dragging the rest of the team with him back to where they started. On their fourth attempt, Strether set out first and managed to go past the traverse, the most critical stretch, but this time, it was now Gillett who slipped and brought them all falling back down at the bottom. By this time, they had no ice axes left, and the moon was setting in. They had to call it a day. Again, they embraced each other as they slept to keep each other warm. Emery and Colbert have started to suffer from frostbite, with Colbert's being worse. Meanwhile, Gillett was behaving incoherently. As soon as the sun rose the following day, they went on their fifth attempt. Having had no food or water for the past couple of days, Strether decided they should try again without tying themselves up. It was Emery who went first this time, and along the way, they found Strether's ice axe attached to the ice wall. Now, the four climbers successfully reached the traverse, and just had to descend a little in order to go back to the ridgeline where the trail back to the camps were. Emery made it back to the ridgeline safely, then Strether followed. Colbert was supposed to be next, but struggled to descend with his other foot bare and frostbitten. Strether decided to go back up to help him using the rope, but in the most critical moment, Colbert slipped, and with Strether holding him with the rope, they both fell down and were now back at the bottom. Meanwhile, Gillett was able to descend successfully back at the ridgeline. At this point, the roles had now been reversed. Emery and Gillett, who got rolled down originally by the avalanche, were now on the safer side, while it was now Strether and Colbert, the original rescuers, who needed rescuing. Sadly, as much as they would like to rescue their friends the same way they did days prior, they no longer had the strength to do it, having suffered from extreme frostbite and dehydration. In spite of the fall, Strether and Colbert were still alive, yet now very weak. The sun was beginning to set already, and Emery and Gillett decided to go ahead to Camp 4. They initially planned to quickly eat and drink to restore some of their strength, and immediately head back to rescue their friends. Back at the bottom, Strether and Colbert agreed they could no longer survive if they waited out for the sun to rise the next morning, so they tried to climb up again. Strether managed to reach the ridgeline, but Colbert, as he struggled to descend that last stretch to the ridgeline, slipped again and fell back at the bottom. This time his dislocated hip got even worse and he could barely move. Left with no choice, Strether had to start heading his way back to Camp 4 alone without his buddy. He managed to reach Camp 4 and saw Emery, who was in a semi-conscious state. After looking around, he couldn't see any trace of Gillett at Camp 4. Apparently, as Gillett and Emery were heading back to Camp 4 hours earlier, Gillett's pace was faster, and Emery, who was starting to become delirious, was trying to catch up to Gillett with much struggle. However, as he tried to follow Gillett's trail, he fell into another crevasse and became unconscious. The following morning, he woke up and was able to gather back his senses and tried to climb out of the crevice. He managed to get himself out, and along the way, he saw Gillett's footsteps again. He realized that Gillett might have fallen into the crevasse as well, and also managed to get himself out. So, he decided to continue following Gillett's footsteps again. Much to his surprise, the footsteps had stopped at a much deeper crevasse, and it was there that he realized that Gillett fell into it. This crevasse was around a 2,000-meter drop. He tried to shout and call for Gillett, hoping he would get a response, but after doing it many times and failing to get a response, he decided to continue his journey back to Camp 4. As soon as he reached the camp, Emery collapsed. He has already been suffering from extreme frostbite by this time. He regained consciousness a few hours later as he got reunited with Strether. Upon hearing what Emery recounted, Strether tried to go back to the nearby crevasse to look for Gillett. Like Emery, he shouted and tried to call Gillett from the edge of the crevasse but did not get any response. Both Strether and Emery badly wanted to head back for another attempt to rescue Colbert, but their bodies were too weak, dehydrated and extremely frostbitten that they could no longer move their hands. Strether realized he could only help Emery reach Camp 3, with the little strength he has left. The two struggled to walk with their already weak bodies, but managed to reach Camp 3 where Hamilton was waiting for them. Hamilton, who decided not to continue with the climb, started to get worried for his friends on the third day that they had not returned. Concerned for his teammates, he decided to prepare food and drinks for when they would come back and might need something to recharge themselves after a long hike. What he didn't expect was that only two of his friends were back in extremely bad condition, and worse, hearing of Gillett's and Colbert's untimely death. Hamilton assisted Strether and Emery back to Camp 1, where the porters took over, and brought them all to get the medical attention they badly needed. It has not been stated whether the bodies of Gillett and Colbert were ever recovered. Haramash 1 was first successfully conquered the following year by a team from Austria, but it was only in 1995 that Haramash 2 had been successfully conquered by a team from Britain. However, two climbers from the same team died upon descent. The story of this Oxford University Mountaineering Club expedition to Mount Haramosh was not just a horrifying story, but also one that displayed extreme persistence, determination, will, and companionship. More often than not, tragedies have the tendency to push people to the limit, and sadly, tough decisions had to be made on Mount Haramosh. Thank you for making it this far. If you want more of these horrifying stories, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. You may also drop your comments below, we'd love to hear from you. Again, thank you and see you on the next one.